Now, the last thing is World War II. And remember how I said a few moments ago that World War I is really symbolic of a lot of disunity in America. World War II is going to be largely the exact opposite. And there weren't. It's not like we're going to have any problems. For example, we know of Pearl Harbor and the resulting internment of Japanese Americans into camps all throughout the Pacific coast. They were seen as a threat to national security, and it was kind of haphazardly done by just a small group of people, one of them being the President of the United States. So Roosevelt issues the executive order to intern the Japanese Americans. It was challenged in court by Fred Korematsu, who refused to report to the camp, and the Supreme Court upheld the executive order saying that the president had these powers because it was a time of national emergency and he was actually acting as commander in chief. So obviously, that is not a real strong source of unity, nor was the harassing of Mexican youth during the Zoot Suit riots. But these are a couple of examples of continuing discrimination in America. But the ones I'll show you next kind of show us that maybe we're in the beginnings of moving in a new direction out of necessity, because World War II is a total war effort where everybody had to chip in. So, for example, Mexican migrant laborers who were invited to America and are the ancestors of today's Hispanic Americans, the braceros are going to come in and provide agricultural and industrial work during the war. African Americans are going to fight heroically in many cases during the war, mostly doing petty jobs, but some, like the Tuskegee Airmen, are going to fight honorably in the war. Navajo Indians are going to be on the radios, and they were called code talkers because they actually got on the radio and just talked Navajo because there weren't any Germans who had ever heard any Navajo speak to each other. Japanese Americans, amazingly, are fighting in American uniforms, not in the Pacific, but definitely in Europe against the Nazis, and they fought gallantly. And you could definitely, picture. One possible outcome of that would have been the Japanese being upset about the internment and saying, forget it, we're not going to serve this country. It was the exact opposite. They were there to prove themselves as Americans. They fought gallantly in the war as a way to say, see, can't you see that we love America and that we're American people? And the internment thing is something that should have happened. And so all these things put together are going to be a springboard of what we're going to see after the war, where immigration is going to start opening up again. We're going to start to see African American civil rights being addressed. Native American issues are going to be addressed. And in addition to all this, women are going to start to be in the workforce and seeking more rights. And so, definitely not an entirely unified effort, and not all the problems were addressed for sure. But we can definitely see World War II as the end of one era and the springboard for many things that will happen regarding ethnicity and pluralism in the beginnings of modern America, and we'll pick it up with that later. All right, after World War II, we see America reborn once again, just like we saw after the Civil War. In fact, Lincoln himself said in the Gettysburg Address that America needed to be reborn. And, a lot of the issues with slavery were dealt with. We still wound up with sharecropping and Jim Crow and segregation, all these sorts of things. So those things are now going to be addressed when it comes to ethnicity and pluralism in America, and we see some big things happening after the war, namely the civil rights movement of various groups and women also. So the first step is taken by Truman in 1948, where he ends segregation in the armed forces and the civil service, meaning government workers. And this was a big step, a step that people have been talking about before for World War II, and FDR wasn't willing to do that, wasn't willing to take that step. We did have African American units and Native American units in World War II, but they never fought integrated with white soldiers. And so this was a big step, and it kind of set the tone for a lot of the things that we would see happening in the 1950s. The next big shoe to drop is Brown versus Board of Education. And so in this case, we have a lawsuit filed in federal courts by the NAACP on behalf of a young girl in Kansas who was being forced to attend a black school when her neighborhood school was a white school. And so the Supreme Court overturns the decades-old decision in Plessy versus Ferguson that had ruled that segregation was legal as long as the institutions were equal. You could be separate, but as long as they were equal, they were fine, and therefore not violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. But in Brown versus Board of Education, apparently opinions changed, and society had changed, and I think, again, this is only 9 years after World War II. People still have this sense of rebuilding America and addressing old problems. And so the decision in Plessy is overturned, and a new precedent is found that segregation is inherently unconstitutional in the United States. So if we say that you can't segregate schools, which are government institutions, then what other you can't segregate on any institutions. And so those are the implications. Now the problem with the Brown decision is that just because the courts say something doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen. It takes acts of Congress and the president to make these things be implemented. And at the time, Eisenhower and the Congress weren't all that interested. They did do some things, but they definitely weren't willing to pass legislation that would enforce the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So change is going to require a fight, and that's what we see throughout the civil rights movement. So the next thing that happens is the Montgomery bus boycott. This is where we meet Rosa Parks and where we meet Martin Luther King for the first time. So in Montgomery, Alabama, the busing system is segregated to a degree, somewhat. It's whites can sit in the front of the bus and blacks sit in the back of the bus. And Rosa Parks, of course, in a plan established by the NAACP that they were going to challenge this law. And so she refused to give up her seat in the front of the bus and was arrested, and she allowed it, and they decided to use that moment as to launch a boycott of all buses. So African Americans are no longer going to ride the buses, which are going to cause some severe economic trouble for the city of Montgomery, and they bring in a young preacher from Atlanta named Martin Luther King to lead the boycott. It's a smashing success. The city folds pretty rapidly, and now African Americans are allowed to sit wherever they want on those buses. And so this is obviously broadcast around the country, and it was kind of the early spark that got people moving in terms of civil rights activism. And that was just the first thing that MLK did. And the rest of the things he does are in cooperation with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So anything that we know that Martin Luther King does is through this organization. So they're going to they're basically made up of black Christians and black churches who are going to engage in peaceful demonstrations, a la Jesus and Gandhi, who are the people that Martin Luther King had studied when he was in graduate school. We have other things going on too. The college students in North Carolina formed an organization called SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they engaged in an activism called sit-ins. And so in sit-ins, you'd go into segregated lunch counters or little diners and things, and you would sit in the seats that you weren't supposed to sit in, and you would demand service and not leave until you were forced out. And as we can see in this picture, it was ugly a lot of times. Milkshakes and fries and harassment would spill over onto these students. But again, people watch on TV. Activists grow in response to this, and the movement gets up to 1,000 students and spreads across the country. And they apply that principle to other kinds of activities as well. The Freedom Riders are also very notable from the civil rights movement, and they went around on buses and engaged in activism to try to promote an end to segregation. Every stop they made, they were met with mobs and attacks, and at various times they required federal protection as they moved around. A pivotal moment is Birmingham when Martin Luther King and his crew decide to launch a peaceful demonstration, a peaceful march through the city, which had the reputation of being the most racist city in America at the time. And it was perfectly set up because they had the villain, which was the police chief named Bull Connor, and he basically unleashed on the demonstrators, turning fire hoses on them, attack dogs, and whatnot. And the thing that made this pretty epic was the fact that it was broadcast on TV, and so the whole country, for many people, for the very first time, are going to see the ugliness of segregation in the South, and say to themselves, no, I mean, of course this is not equal. They're promoting separateness, but by no means is this equal. It's inherently unequal because only one side is making the rules and one side is holding the power. And so people, including the president, John F. Kennedy, are watching on TV, and this moves a lot of people to start demanding civil rights legislation that will finally enforce the decision that was made by the courts in Brown versus Board of Education. Shortly thereafter, in the late summer of that year, 1963, we have the Washington March, which is where Martin Luther King delivers the I Have a Dream speech. The goal was to get 200,000 people marching peacefully. Black and white demonstrators showed up. And the goal was to sensing that JFK was pursuing civil rights legislation or planning to make a push for it. This was supposed to be the thing that finally pushed him over and made him do it. So rewind now back to 1964. Of course, President Kennedy died in 1963 in November, and this is only a couple of months after the I Have a Dream speech, and we have a lot of evidence to suggest that he was getting ready to move on a push on Congress to pass civil rights legislation. So he dies, and a lot of the wind goes out of the civil rights activists because Kennedy was supposed to be their guy who was going to deliver. And now what they winded up with was the vice president, who now became president, Lyndon Johnson. And of course, Lyndon Johnson is the antithesis of what Kennedy was. He is a Southern, Texas, seemingly traditional white racist Democrat guy. That's what at least everybody expected. But Johnson surprised them all because upon taking office only a couple of months later, we get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this is the law that's finally going to give teeth to the Brown versus Board of Education decision that went down 10 years earlier. So the law says, among other things, that racial discrimination in public facilities, meaning government facilities, is banned, and racial discrimination in private facilities open to the public that provide services to the public is also pretty much banned. We have a new bureaucracy called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that's going to enforce these rules and go around monitoring discrimination in hiring and whatnot. And it was a major piece of legislation. Obviously, it's still with us today. It's been amended many times. And this is ultimately the thing that ends segregation once and for all. The problem with the law, though, is that Congress's authority was very much stretched in getting this law, forcing businesses to serve people that they didn't necessarily want to serve. And we would all agree that these are things that needed to happen, but as far as from a constitutional perspective and the power of Congress and the scope of government, there's definitely some issues. When I had mentioned earlier that we needed civil legislation on voting rights, that happens in 1965, the following year. So the Voting Rights Act cleaned up and banned all remaining obstacles to African Americans voting as late as 1965. So the one big thing was literacy tests, and this ultimately puts restrictions on southern states from doing any kind of activity that is going to attempt to disenfranchise people. Other things that are going on with the Great Society, which is Lyndon Johnson's program, domestic program, largely centered on civil rights, but it also addressed things like poverty. Poverty that includes various races. So we're going to see things like welfare go through. Bilingual education for Hispanics and other groups that are struggling in education aid to impoverished areas. Transportation improvements, again, many of the customers for public transportation are going to be those that are racial minorities or low-income families who needed that help. Same thing with housing projects. And of course, affirmative action, which we'll talk more about later. But this is the idea that in order to level the playing field, that preferential treatment should be given to racial minorities and women in terms of enrollment in education and also hiring and promoting in the labor force. So by the time we get to 1965, a lot of the attention is now being placed on voting rights. And so, in addition to the problems that we have with segregation, still we're having African Americans who aren't being allowed to vote, despite the 15th Amendment that was passed way back in the 1860s that said that black males can vote. The South is still pulling lots of shenanigans to create ways to block blacks from voting. And there were lots of things. There were literacy tests, for example, where you had to pass a reading test. And a lot of poor blacks in the South were unable to pass reading tests. Or poll taxes, same thing. A lot of impoverished African Americans in the South couldn't afford to pay the poll taxes. And then other things like downright intimidation, you got the KKK running around and whatnot. And so blacks are not voting, they're not being registered to vote, and they're also not getting elected to office, which is what needs to happen for more rapid change to happen in the area of civil rights. Now, one of these gets addressed in 1964 with the 24th Amendment. That finally bans poll taxes, but there were still other problems persisting. And so one plan went down in that same year, and that was called Freedom Summer. And again, there was the college students who were leading the charge, both black and white. And this was the ultimate summer camp, summer vacation camp, where northern students are going to go down into the deep South and go around on a campaign to try to get African Americans registered to vote. And they met steep opposition. In fact, 3 of them were killed, as we could see in the poster there. And their bodies were discovered in a swamp. And their perpetrators, who there was pretty good evidence as to who it was, a white judge, stonewalled conviction, and they basically walked. And there's a famous picture of Martin Luther King holding that missing sign, and it was really a big mobilizing factor to try to get, in addition to what had been recently adopted for civil rights, more legislation for the purpose of voting rights. One last push to get voting rights legislation through was the Selma to Montgomery March. And so King, again, in the spring of '65, is going to engage in a march, this one from city to city, 54 miles between Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. And there is actually a bridge that you have to cross, pictured on the bottom picture there, where, to get from one city to the other, you have to go across a narrow bridge, and so there were people there waiting for them. There were attacks, there were skirmishes, and 2 people wind up getting killed. And it just showed that the struggle was still very much continuing, even though successes had been met. In fact, King himself would be assassinated in 1968. And so it was a triumphant and a sad chapter in American history, but one where a lot of courageous people continued to press on and refused to give up on the goals that they had set. While all that is going on, we have some other groups who are making civil rights pushes. The Mexican Americans are active, and of course the most notable figure is Cesar Chavez, who fought for the rights of migrant farm workers. And so remember, we got to go all the way back to before World War II when the Bracero program is going on. And basically what happens is we get families established, the descendants of these Braceros, who continue in the family business or continue in what their ancestors done, which is being farm labor. And so conditions are very rough, pay is very low, and there weren't a whole lot of rights for these workers. And so Chavez is going to become an activist for these workers and form the United Farm Workers. And they engage in lots of activities, collective bargaining with farm owners for better pay and better conditions, fewer hours, and things like that. But also to push for legislation to improve these conditions as well. So the most notable instance was the National Grape Boycott, which had mostly negative results. It didn't really go as they planned, but it did bring attention to the subject of migrant farm workers and their rights. And so, it also brought a lot of attention to the issue of immigration, across the Mexican border. And Americans, for the first time, are really going to start asking questions about what it means, why immigrants come to America, better conditions, and we're kind of reevaluating the whole immigration situation. Asian Americans are coming in big numbers too. After World War II, the biggest group that's going to start coming are Southeast Asians, mainly in the face of trying to get out of the area when Vietnam is going on. So a lot of refugees come into the United States. A lot of people migrate, and a lot of them coming to California, in fact, in Central Valley. And we see a kind of a new immigrant group. We know that the Chinese and the Japanese had come before them. And again, by this point, is the trend usually happens is people from the same region tend to stratify when we have different immigrant groups coming at different times. So, for example, white Europeans from Ireland, the early ones came, got established, and then didn't always look so fondly on the subsequent Irish that came. Same thing with the Germans, or Chinese and Japanese immigrants who have now established in the late 20th century are not going to look quite so fondly on the Southeast Asians that are coming along. And so it's kind of interesting how that happens, how your nationalism or your devotion to your ethnic group also falls into economic and political considerations too. But now that a couple of generations has gone by for Southeast Asians, they're beginning to get rooted in America as well. And then the most recent group to start coming are the Arab Americans, which can be lots of different kinds of people. But we see one big group of refugees coming to America in the 80s, mainly from Afghanistan, to try to get out of the war that was happening there between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. And then again after 9/11, when the war in Iraq starts, all the way up to today, with our debate we're having these days about Syrian refugees coming in to get away from ISIS and the civil war happening in Syria. So this is kind of the current hot topic of immigration, along with border security. And so we'll see how this continues to play out in the coming years.